So you thought it should be around, what, 15 minutes?
15, yeah, 20 would be okay.
Okay,
The 25, I think, is pushing it just a little.
okay, well, I'll try. Hi.
Hi, I'm Diane Garber. I'm a friend of one of your congregants, your members, and I am so excited to hear your story.
Oh,
A million years ago, my mom's been involved in all these different Jewish groups. I have a pretty good Jewish background. Um, and the first time that I heard the Shanghai story, I was a consultant at Price Waterhouse, and my territory then I was in Dallas. There's a beautiful shopping center there,
yeah.
and they had a whole exhibit of the Shanghai story. And I had a car phone. This is in the early 90s,
Oh,
okay?
yeah, yeah.
It wasn't the real, the portable cell phone.
Excuse me, I gotta edit.
Okay.
Let me
All right.
talk. Let's talk.
Later, but again,
Your name
thank
is
you.
what?
I'm Diane
Garber?
But thank you. I'm so excited to hear this, okay?
Thanks a lot.
You bet. We'll have to get you on the circuit if you're willing.
Thanks.
I came to say hello,
Hello,
to you.
hello,
How are you? It's
hello.
good to see you.
Thanks.
Because I have to leave with my students at the end, so I thought I'd better talk to you now.
Thanks.
So
Good to see you. Thank you.
you're welcome. I did not know this about you.
You did not? No?
I had no clue.
Students, could you
Thanks.
please fill up the
Thanks.
seats in the front here, please? By grade, sit together. We are live streaming our Kristallnacht commemoration today. Thank you. So while we are waiting for some of our other students to arrive, and we are delighted that some people will be joining us by video streaming, we'll be starting with our speaker, our testimony, our witness to the Holocaust and to hear his experience in Shanghai, Ralph Samuel, in just a few moments as soon as everybody is here. So, if the sixth graders who are participating could sit up front, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. If you could sit appropriately, thank you. You can sit here. Thank you. All right. So students here at the Goodman Center are 5th, 6th, and 7th graders. We are being joined by some of your parents. We are being joined by some of our congregants here in person and on the video stream, and with some of their friends and guests who wanted to come hear this story of Mr. Ralph Samuel. Because it was a story that other Jews experienced also after Kristallnacht, which we are commemorating today. The dates of Kristallnacht are November 9th and 10th. Does anybody know what Kristallnacht means or remember what it means? Because hopefully you all know. Yeah, Louis? It's really the event that precipitated or started the Holocaust. There were warnings before then, but absolutely. Does anybody know what Kristallnacht actually means? Yeah, Liam? The night of the broken glass, right? It's a German word. And I understand that we have some sixth graders who will be introducing our program and our speaker. Just to give you a sense of what we will be doing, our sixth graders will introduce the program and our speaker, Ralph Samuel, who is a member of our congregation, and we're delighted that Mrs. Ralph is here too. Understand that's how she's usually referred to. Mr. Samuel has presented many a time at the Illinois Holocaust Center his story, and we are very fortunate to have him here among our family and our congregation. After his presentation, I hope you will ask lots of questions. There are no bad questions. So anything that you want to know about, please feel free to ask. If it makes Mr. Samuel uncomfortable, he'll let you know. And after we finish with the presentation and the questions, we will have a short service where we remember the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust and acknowledge the 13 million who died, 12 to 13 million people who died overall. So sixth graders, are you ready? Please speak into the microphone.
We would like to introduce Mr. Ralph Samuel. His family was one of 20,000 to flee to Shanghai, China to escape the Nazis.
Okay, Ralph, would you like to begin? So just, it's probably pretty obvious to you that there are slides that Mr. Samuel will be referring to in his presentation. So if you can't see the slides, I suggest that you move to a place where you can see it. Does anybody feel that they need to move? Do you want to move? Do you want to move over here? Great. Okay.
Okay.
Ralph, thank you so much for being here and for teaching our students and our whole congregation.
Wow, welcome. I'm Ralph Samuel, and I was born in Shanghai, China. But in order to provide some perspective, I need to describe what brought my parents there. My parents were born in small towns in Germany, in northern Germany, near the Baltic Sea, in the early 1900s. My father was from Damgarten and my mother was from Strelitz, the two towns identified on the map.
I just want to check, can everybody hear
Okay? They attended public schools where their friends were not Jewish. However, religion did not appear to have been an issue. Regardless, my grandfather was insistent on not displaying any Jewish identity in their home. When they walked to their synagogue, he wrapped his prayer book in tallit and newspaper. They were living in a small town. Everyone knew they were Jewish, but he still wanted to hide this. My father's family owned a granary that sold seed to the farmers in the spring and purchased and distributed the harvested crop in the fall. This business had been in existence for many years through the 1800s, going through several generations of the Samuel family into the early 1900s. At one point, my grandfather had received a commendation from the royalty that ruled over this region of Germany for his service and support. My mother's father, Adolf Seemack, fought in the German army in World War I in 1914. For many years, the family had owned a dry goods store that sold fabric. Next, please. And the store was located on the main street in the heart of Strelitz. And that's actually a postcard that was made in 1900. That happens to be the main street, and that's where the store was located, and that's the picture of the store. My grandmother had to close this store during the Depression and the early 1930s. In 1934, my mother was encouraged to move to Rostock, a larger town where she got an office job because their store had closed. However, due to the difficult conditions in Germany, they didn't get married. She met her future husband in there, but they did not get married until 4 years later. After their wedding, they lived in Rostock, my father's hometown. During the 1930s, my father's farm products business declined as the Nazis enacted laws that canceled debts owed to Jews. When the farmers' debts were forgiven by the new laws, my father lost what remained of his grain business. The new restrictive laws were succeeding in driving Jews out of business and hopefully getting them out of the country and making life more difficult. Only 3 months after my parents' wedding, they lived through Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, which is what we're here to commemorate, on November 9th, 1938. At this point, they realized that they had to prepare to leave Germany. Jewish men were now being arrested. Oh, thank you. Jewish men were now being arrested and taken to detention centers. To avoid detection, my parents left Rostock, moving to several towns before traveling by train to Berlin. Shortly after they arrived in Berlin, they learned from their mothers, when they called home, that Nazi SS officers had searched their home in Rostock looking for my father. The officers had interrogated my grandmothers for information about them. My parents had never told their mothers where they would be, so that their mothers were quite honest in telling the officers they had no knowledge of where they were. In Berlin, they would frequently move to different Jewish homes to avoid detection. So if you can imagine, every night they moved to a different place to avoid being found. At each stop, the family would give them names of other families to contact for future nights. In some cases, the men of these homes had already been arrested by the Gestapo. On one occasion after Kristallnacht, they were taking a cab to another part of Berlin. The cab driver, a proud Nazi, graciously offered to give them a tour of the destroyed synagogues, shops, and Jewish homes that had been destroyed on Kristallnacht. My parents thanked the driver and told him they had no time for sightseeing and requested to take a direct route. I should note that my father was tall, blond, and blue-eyed and simply did not look Jewish by Hitler's standards. Being less obvious made it less threatening for my parents to move around. At this point, they explored all possible avenues to leave Germany. They considered many countries, but none would take immigrants. By sheer coincidence, on one occasion, they met friends on the street who told them that they possessed 4 tickets on an ocean liner traveling to Shanghai, China. Unfortunately, the couple could use only 2 of these tickets, because the other 2 tickets were for their parents who were too old and infirm to travel. My parents immediately offered to purchase those 2 extra tickets. Therefore, thereafter, they proceeded to make travel arrangements, including travel permits and train tickets to the Italian port of Genoa. Next. And here you see pictures. I want to explain this for a moment. These are 2 photos. This photo is of 2 passports, German passports. And particularly of note is my mother has a middle name on there that you might not be able to read from there, is Sarah. Well, she did not have a middle name until the Nazis enacted a law that all Jewish women had to have a middle name, Sarah. So everyone would know that they're Jewish right off the bat when they get their name. The other thing to note on there is the red J for Jew, Judah. And finally, in smaller print, there's a swastika. And just a few points here of note on this is their passport. Their ship, the Italian liner Victoria, was scheduled to depart for Shanghai on February 23rd, 1939. By this time, they were allowed to take only $4 per person plus possessions. Since they had ample funds, they purchased large steamer trunks and loaded them with everything they thought they possibly might need in their new life in a strange country where they really didn't know what they were going to need. So they just guessed. They bought clothing, bedding, cookware, and other items. However, they were forbidden to take any valuables such as diamond rings. Anybody caught attempting to take such items out of the country would have been immediately arrested. They traveled by train from Berlin through northern Italy to the port city of Genoa. For their security, they rode in separate compartments on the train. While traveling through Germany, passengers were not allowed to take photos out the windows. Photography was allowed only after the train had crossed the German border into Italy. German SS officers regularly moved about the train, monitoring passengers. Oh, next, please. And that map shows the route starting in Germany, Berlin, and the arrow going south to the port of Genoa, and then we're going to now follow that red trail all the way around. Their ship traveled south from Genoa along the west coast of Italy, through the Mediterranean Sea, Suez Canal, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and so forth, all the way around, came close to the, very close to the equator, actually, and where it was extremely hot. And next. And there's just a couple of photos of that's the ship, and a couple of photos from along the way. Those are my parents on the right, and on the left, you see ox carts being used to unload the ships from cargo. After nearly 2 months at sea, their ship arrived in the port of Shanghai. Shanghai was one of the few places in the world that accepted Jews at this time. Many Jews had fled here earlier in the 1900s from Eastern Europe and had become part of the Shanghai community. In addition, there were also many Middle Eastern Jews that had settled in Shanghai. It had been a bustling port city for many years and had many foreign residents. The refugees were met at the ship by members of HIAS, that's the Hebrew International Aid Society, who had arranged for them to be picked up in open trucks and driven to a reception center known as the Heim. That's a German word for home. Here they were given information about living opportunities, food, and other necessities. To provide temporary shelter, large dormitory rooms had been furnished with bunk beds. Men slept in a separate dorm. Men and women slept in separate dorms. These close quarters caused a lot of tension that often resulted in disputes and fights. Each day, the central kitchen served hot meals in a dining hall that provided basic nourishment. This Heim was only meant to provide temporary shelter and guidance to the refugees to help them find housing elsewhere in Shanghai. After 2 weeks of seemingly endless searching, they found a one-room apartment in the Hongqiu district. Here, the living conditions were primitive. Cooking was done on a small grill. Toilets consisted of a barrel, a barrel-like pot that was emptied daily by a Chinese worker. Screenless windows provided no protection against insects. However, this all was still better than living in a dormitory. Once my parents got settled in their apartment, they were on their own and had to figure out how to make a living. They initially sold some of their possessions. Next. After pursuing several ideas, and I want to stop here for a moment, those are the two, once they had an address and they found their apartment, then now they registered and became, if you will, citizens of Shanghai temporarily. And these are their registries. And one thing to note here, they're written in English, and I realize you guys might not be able to see this. These things are written in English and Chinese, and then later the Japanese added their identity to it so that the vertical writing is Japanese, the horizontal is Chinese. After pursuing several ideas, they realized there was a sausage factory in Shanghai. Since they were Europeans living in the well-to-do parts of Shanghai, my parents decided to sell them sausages. So my father purchased a backpack and then bought several sausages from the processor. He went by streetcar to one of the European districts and there went from house to house. To his surprise, he quickly sold all the sausages that they had bought that first day. He then developed a route of customers and did this on a regular basis. This business lasted several months until the Japanese military took control and restricted the movement of the stateless Jewish refugees. They created the ghetto, the designated, quote, the designated area, in early 1943. This fenceless area in the Hongqiu district was about 1 square mile of narrow lanes with very primitive housing. It was only defined by 4 streets that served as the boundaries. The announcement was made by the Japanese military, posting signs throughout the region in Shanghai stating that the Jewish refugees had to move to this area within 1 week. Residents of the ghetto would have to request a permit to leave during the day and had to return to the ghetto in the evening. These passes were issued by Goya, the head of the Japanese military detail, who gave himself the title King of the Jews. He was a very short man and would sometimes stand on his desk to be taller than the refugees when they walked by his desk. For the next 2.5 years, until the end of the war, 1945, the 18,000 refugees were confined to living in this ghetto. At one point, during this period, a high-ranking Nazi SS officer arrived from Japan to meet with the Japanese officers in Shanghai. It was learned that the purpose of his visit was to discuss plans for the Japanese to develop gas chambers to exterminate the 18,000 Jewish refugees in the ghetto. However, the Japanese refused to consider any such plan and agreed only to maintain the ghetto. Due to the humid climate and bad conditions, many refugees contracted tropical diseases like malaria and scarlet fever. They had never encountered such diseases in Europe. Consequently, many refugees, including my mother, became very ill, and some died from their diseases. Next. I was born in October 1941 in the Mount Moriah maternity ward, which was staffed by refugee doctors. When the time approached to give birth, my mother traveled by rickshaw, drawn by a coolie running barefoot through the streets. My sister Ruth was born in the ghetto 2.5 years later, in 1944. A staple food in Shanghai for us at that time was rice. It was cheap, it was affordable, and it was easily accessible. But that presented a problem, one challenge. The rice was infested with small insects. So when you poured rice, you also got the insects with it. To make it edible, the rice had to be thoroughly boiled. Then while the rice was boiling, the little critters were now dead and taken off the top, skimmed off the top of the water, and then the rice was boiled some more. As the Japanese army expanded their efforts in the Shanghai area, they stored munitions near the refugee ghetto. Then later in the war, these storage facilities became targets for the American bombers. To reduce the danger to the refugees who were trapped in the ghetto, American planes would sometimes skywrite the time that they planned to bomb and to allow people to seek shelter. When the bombings were imminent, air raid sirens were sounded. Sometimes we would go to a nearby Chinese jail that was located at the edge of the ghetto. Here we sat on the floor along hallways until the all-clear sirens were sounded. To this day, I still react to sirens. Shortly after the end of the war, we experienced some new challenges in the ghetto. When the Japanese had originally created the ghetto, they had forced us to move into housing that had previously been occupied by Chinese. After the war, the Chinese who had lived in this housing now demanded their homes be returned. In our case, a Chinese family camped outside our door and was ready to barge in if the door was opened. Consequently, when my father returned from an errand, he was unable to open the door because it was blocked by Chinese. My mother had to lower supplies to my father from the second story until using a basket tied to a rope. My father could not get access to our blocked apartment. This situation lasted a few days until authorities assured the Chinese that they would get their homes back when the refugees moved out. So these Chinese had camped right against our door right through the night. They brought supplies. Then the U.S. Army and the highest organization came to our aid, supplying food, blankets, and other necessities, and the Chinese had left temporarily. After the war, communications were again possible with the outside world after we had been virtually isolated for about 3 years. Through this system, we learned that both of my grandmothers had lost their lives in concentration camps in 1942. After the U.S. Army got established in Shanghai, many of the troops and equipment were sent home to the U.S. To support their efforts, the Army recruited local civilians for various duties. My father got a job driving Army personnel carriers and other trucks. For the first time in several years in Shanghai, my father was earning a living again. After the war, I was enrolled at the Horace Kadoorie School that had been established by a wealthy Jewish benefactor who had been a long-time resident of Shanghai. Starting in kindergarten, I attended the school during our last 2 years in Shanghai until 1947, when we prepared to immigrate to the U.S. During an examination by our doctor, my parents were told that my tonsils were presenting a problem and needed to be removed. This procedure would be performed at the nearby immigrant clinic, a primitive hospital. The morning my parents brought me to the clinic, they assured me that they would be waiting for me when the procedure was completed. The only thing I remember was being seated in the nurse's lap by a rubber covered by a rubber blanket. The next thing I remember is waking up in a crib located near a window in the men's ward. I was told that my parents could not come back into the hospital to see me for a couple of days, which stretched into a week. There had been an outbreak of a contagious disease requiring the staff to quarantine the hospital. That meant I was alone and could only see my parents through the window, waving to me from the courtyard below. Following the war, my parents actively searched for countries where we could resettle. Most countries, including the U.S., responded that their immigration quotas were filled and they simply didn't accept immigrants. This search, with the help of highest personnel, continued until sometime in 1947, when the U.S. temporarily set aside the immigration quotas. Our family could now apply to immigrate to the U.S. In the weeks that followed, my parents completed the necessary paperwork and medical exams and x-rays and so forth. Then in the fall of 1947, we received notice that our family had been accepted to immigrate to the U.S. Next. 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 There, yeah, no, okay, that's fine. Sheer jubilation is the only way to express my family's feelings after receiving acceptance for the first time in over 10 years. My parents had found a country that was willing to accept us. They were no longer going to be on the run from tyranny and had a chance to start their lives over in a free country. We traveled to the U.S. On a ship known on a U.S. Navy warship, the SS Marine Adder, which had been decommissioned after the war. Next. After a brief stop in Japan, the ship, this is the route that we took coming to the U.S. We stopped briefly in Japan and then on to Hawaii, where we spent one day sightseeing in Hawaii while the ship was reloaded and then refueled. After very rough seas for several days, our ship finally neared the California coast and approached the Golden Gate Bridge. In anticipation, virtually no one slept that last night, and most passengers gathered on deck to gaze at the magnificent skyline. The ship waited offshore until dawn and then slowly proceeded under the Golden Gate to the docks in the San Francisco Bay. After arriving at our hotel in downtown San Francisco, the first thing we did, and I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think was the first thing we did when we arrived in the hotel? Who's got you? I can't hear you. Food? Well, we got food, but no, that's not, no. Yes,
Well,
back there? You are right. Well, you're close. We took a bath. My sister and I had never seen a bathtub. There was no bathtub for us in Shanghai. So this is something that's a bit strange unless somebody's experienced anything like that close to this. Within days after our arrival, my parents were put to work looking for a city to settle in the U.S. Working with advisors from the highest agency, gave us suggestions, and then we took a train to St. Louis, where we settled. Next. Yeah, and that's a photo from our apartment in St. Louis and our family. And next. So finally, the larger lessons of these experiences are perseverance, response to changing conditions, and luck. And next. As a postscript, about 60 years after we had left Shanghai, my wife and I returned to China for business, touring, and to revisit Shanghai and the Ghetto. The change to the city was amazing. Only a portion of the Ghetto now remains intact, surrounded by high-rise apartments. For contrast, shown here are two photos, and before I go on to the photos, that photo on the right in the upper right corner, that's an alley in the Ghetto. That was the Ghetto where we lived. And it's still inhabited, very, very primitive, but they now have electric light, and they have, well, we had electric light, but they have, it's a little bit upgraded from, they have toilets. And then these are just some other shots of the Ghetto. But this is how they're drying their clothes. And then that picture of me there that's the Kaduri School where I went to school. The signs are down now. It's used as an office building. But that was my grade school. And next. For contrast, I'm showing two photos here. We're taken virtually identical, the same spot. The photo on the right is our family in 1947, and the background you see is a river, and behind the river is just desolate land. And the picture on the left is me and the railing. This is on the Bund, along the Bund in Shanghai. And back, what you see across the river is the same land. Now it looks like New York City. So that's the contrast of the modern Shanghai. Finally, the remaining evidence, next slide. Finally, the remaining evidence of our family's existence in the Shanghai ghetto is the inscription of each of our names on a wall at the Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, located across the street from the remaining part of the ghetto. And the large enlargement shows my name, and all of our family is on there, as well as 18,000 other Jews that lived there. Thank you for being a great audience.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm sure we have many questions that our students and guests would like to ask. Who would like to begin?
In Shanghai, what language did you speak?
German.
So was that in your, obviously was in your home. Was that also at school? That you spoke German?
The school tried to get us to speak English. And so that's where I first learned English. But they did speak German when necessary.
Okay. Next question.
We never spoke Chinese.
Was it hard growing up in China?
What made it, maybe I'll ask a little bit different. What made it hard to grow up in Shanghai for you as a young child?
You know, if you don't know, if your life is living like you are now, and you were suddenly thrust into complete deprivation, and you're deprived of everything you own, it would be a very, very difficult life. But if you start out with nothing, and your only toy is a little wooden wagon, let's say, or a little, some little object, then I like to make a joke out of Timmy the stick. You got a stick, you can hold it this way or that way. I mean, if you don't have anything, then you don't miss it. And so my sister and I never really felt deprived because we didn't have anything to begin with. You only feel deprived if you have something and it's then lost.
Next, yes.
How nervous were you when you went to the surgery and you had to have your tonsils taken out?
I'm sorry.
How nervous were you when
how
you had
nervous?
your tonsils taken out, when you were going to the surgery?
I don't remember much of that, to be honest, but yeah, I was nervous, but I was quickly put out. And my problems were afterwards, where I got locked into the hospital because of the quarantine. Yeah, I was scared.
Do you still remember, German, a lot of it?
Yes. I still speak German, although not as fluent as I used to.
Fascinating. I have two quick questions. One is, when your community in China was together, did you have collective Jewish Chagim celebration of Judaism? And then second question, was there any type of postal communication back to Germany for your collective communication, your collective community?
The only communication was after the war, not during. During the complete cutoff. And that's why I pointed out in my presentation that it was only until in 1945 that my parents learned that both of their mothers had been murdered in the concentration camps. You had another
And the first question was about what type of Jewish celebrations, if any, did you have when you were living in Shanghai? Maybe you can talk about it. Do you have any Jewish memories of that time in your life?
Honestly, I don't remember. And my mother's not here for me to ask. So I can't answer that, no.
Oh, okay, we have someone else who can answer that. Mrs. Ralph?
Oh, there was a synagogue in Shanghai, Moish, Oil Moish, and that is now
Moshe.
OLE.
Yeah.
And that is now the Jewish Refugee Center, where they have all the exhibits and displays on the show. So that there was
ongoing
synagogue.
religion, but honestly, it's only what's been told to me afterwards. I mean, I don't remember any of that.
Besides the authorities who were keeping you in the ghetto, did your family or the Jewish community experience anti-Semitism in Shanghai from just the regular people who lived there?
No. The Chinese were extremely hospitable. They were more curious, and people they'd never seen a white. Many of these had never seen white people before, and my parents had to make sure that when we went somewhere that they didn't touch us, because they always wanted to touch you. And so it was, we were treated very hospitable.
How about the Japanese? How did they treat you? Because they were on the side of the Germans.
Yeah, the Japanese, we were, of course, their prisoners, if you will, but they did not treat us as their opponents, if you will, their enemy. They just felt that they were partners with Germany, therefore they had to contain us. And so they bowed to the German wishes, at least putting us in the concentration camp, into the ghetto. But nothing more than that. And as long as we abided by their rules, they got a bit rough. They wanted to let you know that they were boss, but they did not abuse unless if somebody challenged them, then it got rough.
So was the ghetto guarded by the Japanese?
Oh, absolutely, 24 hours. There was no fence. It was a fenceless, the 4 streets that bounded, and God help you if you crossed one of those streets without your permit.
Do you know how your name would be on that little plaque thing, or how they would get it?
So I think what Henry's asking is the memorial up here.
Yes.
Who kept the record so that they knew who were the Jews that had lived in the ghetto?
There was or is a directory of the refugees that first came and then expanded, obviously, because I didn't come there, I was born there. But there was a directory of the families that originally came to the ghetto, came to Shanghai.
I have 2 questions. One, did anyone get killed in the Shanghai, like with the ghetto? And second, how was it to see all the destruction from Pearl Harbor in Hawaii?
Okay, the first question was,
Was anybody murdered, I think is really the question. In the ghetto, is that what you're asking, Russell? Well, in Shanghai, of the Jews. I mean, I'm sure there was somebody murdered, but you're thinking of the Jews in this case?
let me answer that question first. There were at least 30 Jews murdered, killed in during the bombing by the Americans. I mean, it was inadvertent, it was a mistake. A bomb went off target and landed in the ghetto and killed 30 some odd, more than 30 Jews, and in addition to injuries. So that was a horrible situation at that time.
So Shanghai got bombed because it was occupied by the Japanese, is that?
Yes. The Americans were trying to drive the Japanese out, and they knew that they had to do their bombings carefully, but things that ain't always that accurate. So this is why we stayed. We would go to this Chinese jail that allowed us to sit in the hallways. But yeah, there were some mistakes made, and unfortunately, one of them was really bad, but the others were less. There was a huge munition dump right behind the ghetto. The Japanese had intentionally put it there, knowing that if it got bombed, it would take care of a lot of the, okay, so anyway, go ahead.
The second question was, when you got to Hawaii, how was it to see all the destruction from Pearl Harbor in 1941?
So did you get to go see Pearl Harbor when you went to Hawaii?
No,
On that
no.
one day you toured?
No. We only saw the nice areas, the nice parts of.
I think you were due a little nice areas.
It was a
yeah.
brief bus tour.
When you moved to the U.S., was like the Holocaust still going on?
No, the Holocaust was over in 1945, and we moved to the U.S. in late in 47. So that was over 2 years after the Holocaust.
But I want to add, because William, actually, that's a really good question, is that although the Holocaust ended on a particular day, meaning that the Germans were defeated, it took a while for many of the families who were displaced, like the Samuel family, to find a place to live permanently and to kind of overcome all of the adversity, the hard times that they were made to, that in a way it was fortunate that you had those hard times because there were a lot of people who died. Does that make sense? Okay.
I have two questions. First, when you went back, it's not. All right, first, when you went back to Shanghai after you already went to America, were they still holding Jews in the ghettos?
No. The ghetto was then just a small part of the original ghetto, and it was occupied by Chinese people lived there. No.
Okay, and when you were in Shanghai, did you get news about what was going on in Germany?
No. All news, there was no news with the outside world for about 3 years during the war. It was only after the war that we learned what was going on.
So was that after the war ended in Europe or after it ended in?
Both.
Okay. So you had to wait till that time?
Yeah,
Okay.
1945.
Yeah, we'll get.
How did you feel when you got to America?
How did we feel?
Yeah, how did you feel? What was it like to suddenly be in the United States?
It was overwhelming. It was overwhelming because to see clean, people that are clean and food and it was, even though we were quite poor to start with, it was still quite overwhelming, and we were very grateful ever since.
Where did you end up finally settling down in America?
St. Louis.
But how long were you in San Francisco?
6. Yeah, 6 or 7. I was just 7, excuse me.
So how long were you in San Francisco? Was that?
Oh, how long?
Yes,
Just
how long?
a couple, 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
Before St. Louis?
Yes.
Got it. We have lots of questions. Yes.
When you were hiding in the jail, was there anybody in it?
I'm sorry, you got to speak louder. I can't hear you.
When you were hiding in the jail, was there anybody in it?
So when you had to go to the jail because there were alerts about bombs, were there any prisoners?
Were there prisoners in the jail?
Right.
Chinese. That would have been those would have been Chinese prisoners in a Chinese jail. Frankly, I believe there were, but we didn't see them. It was a working jail, but we were just put in the hallways to sail along hallways. It was a well-constructed building, so it was a little more secure than sitting in the open areas.
How did you end up in Chicago?
That's a good question. That was long after I had graduated from engineering school and got through college. And then I had worked, and I went to work in Chicago. I moved to Chicago for a profession and went to work here.
So when we had a conversation, it was for professional opportunities. We're more here than in St. Louis for what he was interested in.
Yes.
Ralph, were you aware of the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when you were in Shanghai? Were you able to see anything or feel anything or even have knowledge of the fact that the
I
atomic bombs
don't
had been
believe
exploded?
so. I think my parents, you know, I want to guess the answer to that is yes, that they had, through some radio and some, because they had put a map up on the wall and would put pins where the forces were converging in Germany and Europe and so forth, and who was going where. And there was, so I think it was by radio that they were getting some information at some point of what was going on.
But the Japanese were still in control of the ghetto.
Oh, yes.
When they were bombed.
Until the very end.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, yes.
I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, but I'm curious, how did you find out about your grandmothers? Did you contact through Germany, or how did they find you? How did that come to?
There was through the, I think it's the Red Cross, but through an international agency that we weren't the only ones that were asking those questions. So they had a format, if you will, that you fill out, complete a format and mail it, or the mails were starting to work. And I don't know if my parents submitted this to the organization in Shanghai or if they mailed it, but the point is it got to Germany, and the Germans were excellent bookkeepers. They meticulously wrote back when, where, and how my grandmothers were lost.
I was just wondering what happened to the rest of the refugees in Shanghai. Did most of them immigrate to the United States? Did anybody stay in Shanghai, or where else did they go?
They all left Shanghai, and many of them immigrated to the U.S. Many went to Israel, and then other countries in the world, but mostly the U.S.
Did you ask one already? Okay. All right.
When you were in the ghettos, how big was the problem of hunger? Was hunger a big problem?
Did you have enough food to eat?
Yeah,
we
didn't. No, we were not. It wasn't a big selection of food, but we were not starving. We ate. We were able to eat decently. Yes.
Do you still eat rice?
Rice? Oh, I love rice. Yes, yeah.
Okay, we're going to do the last question of someone who hasn't. Did you ask a question already? Okay, who hasn't asked a question, and then we're going to do a final 3 questions.
Did you get grossed out by the critters in your rice?
Not really, because it became that was part of, it's like going camping and finding bugs in your bed or in your tent or something. You know that you expect it, and besides, don't forget now, I was very little. It was just my parents told me that, okay, we got to clean it up, and here's how we clean the rice and so forth, and then it's edible. So.
Remember, he knew no different, right? Okay, last 3 questions. 1, 2, 3.
When you were in the Ghetto, how bad was the bombing that was redirected into the Ghetto?
Like, how frequently was the ghetto? Was bombing in Shanghai? I'm going to ask it a little bit larger than you did, Russell.
Well, the bombing, don't forget, the bombing was aimed at strictly at where the Japanese, at the Japanese strongholds. And they were not trying to bomb the ghetto. So they were only bombing around the ghetto and then other areas of Shanghai that the Japanese were holed up in.
Right, so how frequently was it in the years that you lived there before the war was over? Was it like once a year, maybe?
Oh, no, a few months, a couple months, that was it.
Okay,
No, it
thank
didn't-
you.
Because that was nearing the end of the war.
Was it hard to find your name on the memorial?
I can't hear you.
Was it hard to find your name, like in the memorial? Like,
Was it hard to find
there's
my
so
name?
many names.
It's in alphabetical order.
What was it like traveling to like all the places?
What was it like for you to travel from Shanghai to the United States and then from San Francisco to St. Louis?
Well, traveling to the United States from China was on a warship, and this was converted to transport civilians, but the accommodations were still what the military slept in. So we all slept in hammocks, and it's a netting that you sleep in. It's not, you don't sleep on beds. And there was a men's dorm and a women's dorm. And so it was very crude, but we were glad that we were going to America. So you just put up with it temporarily.
And last question?
So in the ghetto, I know there was like 2 separate dorms, but did you get to see like your family like in the day?
Asher, I think what happened is at first they were in dormitories, his parents, and then they got their own apartment. Yeah, so how big was that apartment?
1 room.
Well, that's...
1 room.
That's quite the answer. Well, your story is incredible. We are so glad that you have been here to share it with our students. Folks, we could ask Mr. Samuel how old he is, but even if he lives to 120, he's not going to live forever, nor are all the Holocaust survivors. And you are very, very, very lucky to have the opportunity to hear a survivor tell their story in person. So this is a privilege that you have had. And in appreciation, our 6th graders have a small gift for you and Mrs. Ralph.
Well, thank you.
Wait, stand up. Oh, yes, here, come stand by him.
Thank you very much.
We have to have photo opportunity.
We would like to thank Mr. Samuel and present these yellow flowers to him. They represent the color of the yellow stars the Jewish people were forced to wear.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. We can. And you're welcome to sit down, but now we're going to do a little commemoration because fortunately Mr. Samuel is here, but his grandmothers were not. They did not survive. They were among the 6 million who died. And I'd like to invite, we all have different family stories, and I'd like to invite any of you who know that you had a relative who died in the Holocaust to come forward to help me light the memorial candles, the yahrzeit candles. So,
Excuse me
yes.
1 second.
Go
If
ahead.
I could just make one comment that I completely forgot. My mother, over 30 years ago, spoke here and gave this, practically the same presentation when Rabbi Bronstein was the rabbi for Shoah night. Okay? I just wanted to, I forgot to mention that.
And I'm going to ask some of our sixth graders to, or whatever grade you're in this year, sixth grade, right? It's hard to know, you guys get older every year, to please pass that out for everyone. But if you know you had a relative who either died in the Holocaust or who survived, I'd like to ask you to come forward as we light the memorial candles, the yard site candles. Of course, of course. Everything counts. All right, so if one of you would hold the, so what we're passing out now is the Kaddish, because we are going to say Kaddish in memory of the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. And these are yard site candles that you would light in memory of one of your loved ones, either when they die or on the anniversary of their death. And today we are lighting 6 for the 6 million.